I am going to focus not on the temporary blips, the very, let's say, short-term challenges posed by the pandemic in this briefing. I will focus on the lasting trends, what the Philippines face over the next 10 years, that will make people more optimistic about the future, because I'm going to present to you evidence that the Philippines is considered one of the most attractive emerging markets in the world over the next 10 to 20 years by outside independent think tanks, financial institutions, and others who give their assessments about countries like us. It's so important to be able to focus on these lasting trends, because otherwise we will be easily depressed by the short-term figures that we are seeing. I'm sure all of you know that in the second quarter of this year, there was this drop of 16.5% in our GDP, and unemployment rose percent, and all sorts of huge drops in the production of manufacturing, over 20%, services. Actually, the only sector that posted a positive growth rate was agriculture, 1%. And I'm afraid that over the next 12 to 18 months, we will not see any significant recovery. We will still see all these negative growth rates. And that is why my message is, think at least over the next 5 to 10 years. What are 2 to 3 years of very difficult circumstances compared to what most of you can look forward to? If you are below 40, you still have another 40 years of productive life. And that is why I would like to start this briefing by presenting to you figures that I have gathered all over the world about what outside think tanks, institutions are saying about the future of the Philippines. Mind you, these positive assessments have been made over the last 15 to 20 years, even when we were still called the sick man of Asia. Some of them have been issued more recently, even if these institutions know that we still have a lot of problems, like the way our government has not been managing the pandemic as well as other countries, the way our president is known as not the best president in the world. I don't have to elaborate. Despite all of these weaknesses that they see, as I'm going to present to you, they are all agreed that we are among the countries that will lead the global economy over a 10 to 20 year period. And I ask myself, why do these outside independent institutions think so highly of us? And these are the first fundamentals that I will share with you. Please, the first slide. First slide, please. The first is what we can call our geographic advantage, our geographic dividend. I'm sure many of you have heard the last century being called the American century. There was no doubt that in the last century, the US was on top of the global economy. It was being challenged by Japan. In fact, there was a time in the 60s when some people were writing books like Japan #1. It never happened because Japan stopped producing babies and they aged so rapidly that Japan could not challenge the US anymore towards the end of the last century. And of course, there was also the very strong union in Europe. So in a way, the so-called American century was really a competition among 3 territories: Europe, North America, and Japan. I'm sure many of you have heard that this century is called the Asian century. There is no doubt that Asia will dominate the whole world economically over the next 10 to 20 years, especially also three territories: China, India, and the ASEAN Economic Community, made up of 10 countries to which we belong. Take a look at the lower tables. If you see GDP growth rate before the pandemic, the countries of the American century were struggling just to grow at 0.8% to 2.9%. And there's no reason that they can actually surpass those figures the moment the world returns to normal. These countries are tired countries, already very, very high per capita incomes, but worse, suffering from demographic suicide, except the United States. And that is why their growth rates will be more or less replicating what they had before the pandemic. But take a look at what we in the Asian century were experiencing before the pandemic. Anywhere from 5.2% average of the ASEAN 5 to which we belong, and as I'm sure you will remember, we were above average, we were growing at 6 to 7%, to 6.6 of China, to 7.1 of India, 2 to 3 times the growth rates of the American century countries. And if you've seen some of the forecasts for 2021, 2022, growth rates of 6 to 8% are once again being predicted. And so we are so lucky that we are in the epicenter of the Indo-Pacific region, which is the Asian century. And we're so lucky that all our neighbors have not fallen into this mistake of America first, Brexit, anti-trade, protecting only your industries, and going against one of the most important sources of growth, which is trade. The countries surrounding us are still open to globalization, and especially the ASEAN Economic Community, whose very purpose precisely is to open up markets of goods, services, capital, investment. And that definitely is an advantage that we as an emerging market has. Next, please. Now, I just want to remind you of what 15 years ago Goldman Sachs predicted would be the leading countries in the world for a long time. And I'm sure many of you still recall BRIC: Brazil, Russia, India, China. Unfortunately, Brazil and Russia mismanaged their economies, and people are no longer excited about these two countries. However, remaining are India and China, plus now the ASEAN. And you can see the figures of these emerging markets. In addition to BRIC, next please, Goldman Sachs also added the next 11. I'm sure many of you have seen this in the past. Now, I bring them up because when these were being presented, we were still the sick man of Asia. But despite that, the Goldman Sachs people knew that over the long term, we would overcome some of the challenges that were facing us as a sick man of Asia, which we did, and included us among the next 11 among emerging engines of growth. And you will notice that only 3 Southeast Asian countries are in this list. And I'm sure some of you will remember me suggesting that for you to have an easy memory of these 3 countries, use the acronym VIP. Not very important person, but Vietnam, Indonesia, and the Philippines. The 3 countries in Southeast Asia that will, in the surest way, will dominate the Southeast Asian region because of their very large populations. They're being able to introduce many reforms. And right now, the one who is ahead of us is Vietnam. and because they are very rich in natural resources. Next, please. A more recent positive assessment of the Philippines came out of the prestigious think tank Oxford Economics. This was just last November 2019. Surprise, surprise. The Philippines is only number 2 to India among the 10 leading emerging markets that will dominate global economy in the next decade. This is something coming from the outside. This is not a self-serving propaganda of our government or even by so-called prophet of boom like me. This is from outside. I always emphasize that. And since this was done just last November 2019, they said it despite the fact that our president is being accused of extrajudicial killings, that they see a lot of corruption still in the Philippines. All these things they're able to overlook because they see the fundamentals that I am going to discuss with you that give us a tremendous advantage over a longer term. I just wanted to point out that Indonesia is number 3 and China is number 4. Although China is the only economy now that is growing at a positive rate, that is short term because over a longer period, China has also committed demographic suicide. It's aging so fast that they are not going to have enough young labor force to take care of their senior citizens. In fact, some of you might have already heard that some Chinese organizations are trying to get Filipinos to teach English in China, to go there as caregivers and so on and so forth, because a labor shortage is looming in China. And I'm sure you've heard that their leaders are trying to reverse the one-child policy with no effect. In the same way that Singapore tried to reverse their stop at 2 and never succeeded. In fact, you must have read just recently that right now the population of Singapore has gone down because a lot of their foreigners have left Singapore. Singapore is facing a serious demographic challenge. Next, please. The most recent, already during the pandemic, this was on May 2nd, 2020. This comes from the prestigious group that publishes The Economist. And they presented the emerging economies ranked on 4 measures of financial strength. And the Philippines is number 6, surpassing even China. China is number 10. Vietnam is number 12. Now, why do you think ranks us quite high in financial strength? This is now institutional. The Economist sees what I see, what you see, that we have one of the best central banking systems in Southeast Asia. We have developed a central bank with a lot of very professional people who can manage our monetary sector, whoever are the political leaders. So I was reminded of what I said in 2016, that the Philippine economy will continue to grow whoever the president is. And I say that as regards monetary management. We have a pool of very competent economists, financial managers who can take over Governor Jokno and others in the future. And there is no question that our central bank will continue to be as professional as it has already been literally for decades. The same thing we can say about fiscal managers, now represented by Secretary Dominguez and company. Our fiscal managers, and not only during the Duterte administration, but all the way back at least to the time of Gloria Macapagal-Arroyo, have been so responsible in managing our deficits, keeping it below the 3% maximum, and especially our debt to GDP ratio, which they have kept at 30 to 40%. Just for your information, countries like the United States, Japan, Italy, Spain, do you know what their debt to GDP ratio can be? As high as 100%, 120%, Japan more than 200%. our 30 to 40% stands out as an accomplishment of the emerging market to keep fiscal stability. And that is why, now that there's an emergency, our government can afford to borrow billions and billions of dollars, as you probably read. Right now, $9 billion have been committed to our government in terms of loans without in any way destabilizing our economy, because we still have a low debt to GDP ratio. In fact, people say right now it's about 50%. It can go as high as 70% without damaging its financial strength. That is something that we can be proud of. Next, please. This, again, is evidence that Hong Kong Shanghai Bank, a leading financial institution in the world, thought more than 15 years ago that given a long-term horizon, in 2050, the Philippines will be the 16th largest economy in the world. I'm sure this is not the first time you're saying this, because this has been presented for some time now. Take a look at the countries that we will be surpassing: Indonesia, Australia, Argentina, Egypt, Malaysia, Saudi Arabia, Thailand, Netherlands. Again, the reasons we will see. What did the Hong Kong Shanghai Bank see in the Philippines that made them very optimistic about our economy? We will summarize those factors now. Next, please. The last evidence I want to present to you is the most recent. The Japan Credit Rating Agency upgraded the Philippines from BBB plus to A minus. And that explains to you why those $9 billion are so easy to get. Institutions are willing to lend to us because they see our credit rating as high, A minus. So now, what do all of these institutions, whether think tanks or financial institutions, have in common when they see the Philippines in a very positive outlook over the long run, without in any way being discouraged by those very bad figures during the pandemic? Let me now summarize very quickly those fundamentals. Next, please. The first one, which is really our number one economic jewel, is the demographic dividend. We have young, growing, and in our case, English-speaking population. One of the few emerging markets in Asia that can still boast of a young, growing English-speaking population. As you very well know, all our neighbors to the north, Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, Macau, even China, no longer talk about young, growing populations. The only ones who can really compete with us are Indonesia and Vietnam. Thailand is aging so fast. Malaysia has such a small population. Singapore is the basket case as regards demographic suicide. The second one I already explained to you, the geographic dividend, at the epicenter of the most dynamic economic region in the world. It's now referred to more frequently as the Indo-Pacific region, no longer just Asia-Pacific, because we cannot ignore the power of India. In fact, as you saw in that forecast of Oxford Economics, India is number one. You know, India may have a very difficult political situation. They still have a lot of strife there, but India has about 500 million among its 1.4 billion people who are already middle class. 500 million middle class Indians is no joke. They can grow on the basis of their domestic market, and we should definitely see what we can do in trading with India. The third one I referred to was the temporal dividend. You know, I always tell those who are listening to me right now who are below at least 35 that they the millennials and the centennials have been born at the right time and in the right place. We, who are way over 65, were born at the wrong time and in the wrong place. Why? Because we reached our adulthood when the Philippines was being derisively referred to all over the world as the sick man of Asia. But we're so glad that the next generations that will come after us, many of you who are over 65 have children and grandchildren, you are gifting to your children and grandchildren a much brighter future. And why is that from the economic standpoint? Because in the next 10 to 20 years, the Philippines is going to transition from a low middle income economy, meaning earning less than $4,000 per capita, to an upper middle income economy between $4,000 to $10,000 per capita. And if you still remember, even vaguely, your economics course, your Economics 11, Economics 101 in UP, if you remember the law called Engel's Law, it says when a household, a community goes from a low income to a higher income, that household or community will consume not more and more rice, kamote, basic things, but will shift their demand to more and more sophisticated industrial goods and services. And that is when an economy literally explodes industrially. And that's going to happen precisely because we are transitioning from a low middle income economy to an upper middle economy in the next 10 to 20 years. And that is why I call it the temporal dividend, the dividend given to those who are living in the Philippines at the right time. Then some additional fundamentals. I already referred to why the VIP is considered to dominate Southeast Asia. We have a lot of natural resources beyond our human resources, and especially for tourism. I don't know if some of you read that report of the international magazine Travel and Tourism that ranked Palawan as the best island resort in the whole world, better than Bali. And I'm sure many of you know that Palawan has 2,000 islands. The moment we will be allowed by both national and local governments to move from one province to another, from one island to another, I can assure you there will be an explosion of domestic tourism. Filipino families cannot be kept locked down. They are eager now to go out of their places. They will not be able to travel to foreign places. Oh, that will take at least 3 years. And vice versa. Foreigners will not come to us in any big way in the next 2 to 3 years. The virus will be around even if a vaccine is found and distributed widely, people will still hesitate to travel. So the one that will recover last is travel and tourism. But domestic tourism, as Secretary Romulo Puyat is always saying, is our hope for reviving tourism. Now, all of us know about Bill program of the government. And now, with the lockdowns becoming less and less restrictive, you now see a lot of the infrastructure projects that were postponed again being accelerated. And the good news is also the private sector is equally bullish. If you take a look at all the programs of San Miguel, Ramon Ang, to build airports in Bulacan, to build more and more tollways and so on and so forth, and you people in Cebu have seen the tremendous success of your Mactan Airport with a private-public partnership with Megawide and so on and so forth. That is a very good sign that after consumption, which is right now the #1 engine of growth, because 70% of our GDP is consumption, it will be government spending and private sector spending on infrastructure that will push the economy forward. I'm afraid, and this is a message to you, members of the Mandaue Chamber of Commerce and Industry that in general, investments in other sectors like manufacturing and so on and so forth will not be the leading sector. And I'm sure you already saw how some of the companies in Mactan are closing down and so on and so forth. I'm afraid I'm giving you all the good news, but the bad news I will have to cite, just to be fair, is that I don't see manufacturing, even manufacturing exports, as a lead sector for a long time to come. We are too late to compete with Vietnam, with even Myanmar, and then later on Cambodia and Laos in manufacturing. We already have high wages. Our export possibilities are mostly in services, BPO, IT, and not to mention the more than 10 million people who have abroad. And then hopefully, as I'm going to discuss, in high value products in agriculture that go beyond bananas and pineapples. The mangoes of this world, the avocados of this world, all the vegetables that we could produce for China in particular, whose greatest fear is food security. And I will discuss that when I talk about the challenges. Now, one also very positive change that the pandemic is actually accelerating. It was already happening before the pandemic. I'm sure those of you who study regional figures know that Manila National Capital Region had been growing at the slowest rate compared to the other regions already 5 years before the pandemic began. Even Bicol was growing faster in the NCR. And it is very, very good to see that there are now new areas that will compete with Manila for attracting investments. To be fair, I don't think Cebu is any better than Manila in terms of congestion and overpopulation. That's why I'm not going to give you a false idea that Cebu is going to compete with Manila, because Manila and Cebu have the same problems: too much traffic, congestion. The ones that are really going to attract a lot of investment outside of Manila and Cebu are, first of all, Calabar Zone, especially Batangas. Because now, if you take a look at that corridor from Calamba to the seaport of Batangas City, which many of you are familiar with, there are hundreds and hundreds of factories lining up that corridor. First Philippine Holdings, the ILS, name any large group with industrial zones, and they are located in that corridor. And the governor of Batangas is very forward-looking. He's going to build a road from Calamba to, railroad from Calamba to Batangas Seaport for cargo for all of those hundreds of factories. And he is going to replicate what Ramon Ang has done in Bulacan, to put up a private airport for cargo somewhere in Batangas. And they are going to double the Batangas Seaport, the capacity. I'm sure many of you know that the Batangas Seaport already has more passenger traffic than Manila, because it's the gateway towards the Visayas and Mindanao from Luzon. So these are the possible megapolis, together with what is now called the Pampanga Triangle: Angeles, San Fernando, and Clark, together with Subic. Especially once they finish that railroad from Clark to Bulacan to Manila, that will attract away a lot of investments from Manila. The city that will attract away investments from Cebu is Iloilo. Iloilo is the most attractive city outside of Manila right now, because more than 10 years ago, Senator Drilon, together with the LGU heads in Metro Iloilo, got their heads together and started to build infrastructures for the long run. I'm sure those of you who have traveled to Iloilo will collaborate that. And especially if they're able to build that road from Iloilo to Guimaras to Bacolod, then you will have another mega police. Together, Iloilo and Bacolod can constitute a region that will attract investments away from Cebu and Manila. in Mindanao, it's a no-brainer. Davao. If you take a look at the real estate prices in Davao right now, they're going to the roof because investments are pouring in into Davao. Not only because it is the city of the president, and just to tantalize you, and the city of the next president, and this is of course a joke, no? Depending. I'm sure someone will ask that question later on. But it really has a lot of attractions for expansion away from Manila. Next, please. Now, I talked about all the positive things. Let me talk about the negative things. Long-term challenges. We stand out like a sore thumb in the whole of Southeast Asia as having the lowest productivity in our agriculture sector. We're way behind Thailand, Malaysia, even Vietnam. Because as I'm sure you've heard me in the past say again and again, our leaders neglected farm-to-market roads, irrigation systems, post-harvest facilities in their obsession with industrialization that we have kept rural areas underdeveloped. The highest rate of poverty, as you very well know, is in the rural area. Now we have to address that. And I'm very glad the pandemic has opened the eyes of our leaders how important food security is. And it's also lucky that right now we have one of the best secretaries of agriculture we ever had in William Dar. He's now beginning to lay the foundation for long-term growth in agricultural productivity. The second one that many of you, I'm sure, have been trying to address in your chamber is that there's still too many obstacles to doing business. Red tape, bureaucracy, both from the national and now from local governments, putting up so many obstacles to starting business. And of course, the original source of these difficulties is in our constitution. Our constitution is still too restrictive against investments, foreign investments. I'm sure you know that I was one of those who wrote the constitution, and I'm convinced that we made a terrible mistake putting all of these restrictions against investments in strategic industries that do not exist in Vietnam, a communist country. It's really very funny that Vietnam is more open to foreign investments than the Philippines. And the figures show it. For investment in the Philippines and anywhere from 2 to 3 times investments of foreigners in the Philippines. And I'm sure you know, all those factories that are leaving China because of the US-China war are transferring to Southeast Asia, but not to the Philippines. They go to either Vietnam, most of them, or to Myanmar, or to Indonesia. Another anomalous situation is that our construction industry, especially the build sector, is suffering from shortage of carpenters, of welders, of electricians, of plumbers, and that is a psychosociological problem that you have heard me discuss many times. Many of you are very familiar with SAIT, a very impressive school in Cebu that produces technical skills. We need 100 sites in this country to convince more and more of our young people that they should not take college diploma programs, but should think of blue-collar work. But as you and I know, that is a sociological problem. Parents and young people still are obsessed with a college diploma. I am working with different groups, including the TESTA people, to address that mindset. And hopefully, little by little, we'll be convincing even people from the middle class to be good mechanics, plumbers, and they will be rewarded accordingly. That is already happening. We still have the highest rates of electricity in Southeast Asia, probably in East Asia, next only to Japan. The good news, as you very well know in your own case, is practically all large conglomerates in our country are investing in power plants. The bad news for the environmentalists is that coal will be with us for a long, long time to come. Because precisely to bring down the rates of electricity, we still cannot avoid coal. Of course, we can use clean coal. Corruption and poor governance, I think we will have that for a long time to come. We will, of course, try our best to improve governance. My only consolation, and just to put some light touch to this very serious briefing, you know, I'm among the 2 billion people all over the world who were captivated by the Korean telenovela Crash Landing on You, Chloe. I like very much the series. Why do I mention it? Because for any one of you who have seen that television series, you would have realized that South Korea and North Korea are equally corrupt. There is so much corruption still going on. But the fact is, South Korea is already a first world country, which shows that you can become a first world country even if you have not completely eradicated corruption. That's my hope. No? But definitely we have to do our best to eradicate corruption, not because of our desire to develop the economy, but because corruption is a moral evil. And that's the main reason. High frequency of natural calamities, there's nothing that we can do about it but to be prepared for it. I mentioned Palawan. The fortunate thing about Palawan is that it does not have earthquakes, volcanoes, and tsunamis as compared to Bali. And that is why I think that as long as we put the right infrastructures in Palawan, and in fact, as you know, Palawan will be the only island area that will have 3 international airports in the long run. One in Coron, one in Puerto Princesa, and another one in San Vicente. And that is why it will be visited by foreign tourists in the long term, even more than Bali will be in the future. Next, please. Now, what sectors are going to recover quickly? That's why it's called V-shape. And what sectors will take a long time to recover after the pandemic? The first one, in fact, it doesn't have to recover because right now food and agribusiness is booming. Here in Manila, everyone is either involved in takeouts or people who have never been in baking, doing paella, etc. Everyone is now, I'm exaggerating, but a lot of people who are unemployed and have a lot of time are now getting into all types of food products and selling them to their neighbors, takeouts, and so on and so forth. When I say agribusiness, I don't mean just farming. Agribusiness, as you very well know, includes post-harvest, cold storage, supply chain, logistics, processing. And that's the great thing about Cebu. Cebu can be a processing center for food for our 110 million Filipinos. And in fact, that's another thing that is an advantage of the Philippines. We have a very low export to GDP ratio, so that even if the world takes time to recover from this recession, we can go ahead of the world because we are not dependent on exports. All of our companies can focus on 110 million Filipinos. We're increasingly equipped with purchasing power if we know how to stimulate economic activity. The domestic market is large enough to make the Philippines partly immune from the ups and downs of the world economy. And it starts with food and agribusiness. Is that a secret that all the biggest corporations right now are in food? San Miguel, Rubina, Centurica, name it. Most of them are the ones that are in the stock market. Second, very sunrise sector, again, it's no-brainer. With all this pandemic, everyone has become very focused on expenditures related to health and wellness. Not only curative, people going to the hospitals, paying so much, etc., for all sorts of tests, taking all sorts of medicines, and taking all sorts of supplementary food to improve their immunity. All of these things are going to be a big, big industry for a long time to come. Now, the third one That's exactly what we're doing. We're now connecting with one another through Zoom. The owners of Zoom have become billionaires overnight. And everything that has to do with the digital industry, the so-called Industrial Revolution 4.0, that is definitely going to grow by leaps and bounds. Right now, as I'm sure you know, in our university, everything is taught online. And when things recover and we can already have our students in face-to-face classrooms, still our teachers will insist that part of instruction should still be online. That's going to be part of the normal. And that is why markets for laptops, for computers, first-hand, second-hand, all types of ways. I'm sure you've heard that even the poorest people in rural areas are exchanging their poultry and their hogs for second-hand smartphones so that their children can participate in blended learning. And the last one is anything that has to do with improving the knowledge and skills of the population during a lifetime. Education has become a lifetime process. Not only formal education, but non-formal education and informal education. All the webinars, short courses that don't lead to degrees, but improve the skills of people to be able to adapt constantly to a changing environment. Education will be a growth sector. The ones that are not so lucky, I've already mentioned travel and tourism, except domestic tourism, transport and automotive, malls and other retailing outlets. Even when the vaccine is found, we will still be very cautious about going to crowded areas, dining restaurants, public entertainment. And in real estate, the sector that still is growing despite the pandemic and will grow even more is the economic and low-cost housing sector, the sector that delivers units anywhere from 800,000 pesos to 5 million, because that segment addresses the 10 million overseas workers abroad and the 1.2 million BPO IT workers. That's still a large market, and some estimates that we did in our university show that there is a backlog of anyone from 3 to 5 million in this sector. But what will suffer will be the very expensive real estate, 20 million and above. People will not have the appetite nor the incomes, because a lot of middle income households, whether they are pilots, whether they're stewardesses, whether they're stewards, and so on and so forth, have lost their jobs. So there is not going to be too much market for high-end real estate for some time to come. Next, please. Next, please. So here, just to show you the macro forecast, as we saw 16.5% drop. The estimate for the whole year, we may see a drop of -7 to -10. Let's see. Sorry. Okay. So for the second quarter of 2020, as you can see, while the whole economy was dropping by -6.5, agriculture still grew at 1.6. That is the best news for me, at least, having talked about agriculture for ages. Industry dropped by -22.9, services by -15.8. Those are the largest declines in our recorded economic history, probably except for the Second World War. Next, please. So this is the forecast for 2020. Inflation rate, that's a good news. It's both good news and bad news. Inflation rate is low because our central bank is very good in managing inflation, but it's also low because the demand is very low. People are not buying, obviously prices will not go up. No? And that's especially true about the 48 to 1 dollar situation we're now facing. The ones who made this forecast really have this more as a wish than a real forecast. A lot of the forecasts about the macroeconomy that you will be reading are really guesstimates, because we don't know how this pandemic will behave. We don't know whether we'll have second, third, fourth waves. As you're beginning to realize, even the best countries, Singapore, Hong Kong, South Korea, are suffering from second, third waves. So we don't know really, but of course we have to make an estimate. I also would express my wish that the peso dollar rate by the end of 2020 will be closer to 50 to 51, because it is so unfair to the relatives of the overseas workers for them to get only 48. And not to mention the BPO IT sector. We are actually discouraging exports with a strong peso. So a strong peso is not a sign of a strong economy. And the main reason is our reserves have gone up to the sky, $100 billion. Just to remind you, when Marcos left in 1986, do you know what our general reserves were? Zero. In fact, even less than zero, because some of the officials there were actually creating reserves from nowhere. And now it's $100 billion. But as I said, that is not necessarily a good thing. Now, the growth rate, as I said, for the whole of 2020 may be anywhere from 7.5 to minus 9.5, but use that just as a guesstimate. Industry sector will drop by minus 16.5. Services may recover, like agriculture. Agriculture will be over 2%. That's the end of my presentation. I'm very happy to respond to your questions. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Bernie Villegas. Well, Bernie, I'd like to call that like a feel-good presentation.
I hope it was, yes.
Yeah. Let me ask you the first question, because, well, at the moment we've been on the pandemic crisis for the last 8 months now, and everybody's feeling it. Our unemployment rate has gone down again. Well, we have maybe about 4 or 5 million people unemployed.
Yes.
May I ask you, what assumptions are you making as far as the coronavirus pandemic the virus itself is concerned? Because, as you mentioned, it's very difficult to predict how this virus will act, whether there's going to be a second or a third wave. What assumptions are you making? Are you assuming, I know you're looking at the long term here, you're looking beyond, what, 10 years or beyond?
Yeah.
Are you making certain assumptions that the vaccine will be applied in the middle of next year or after next year? And will it be applied to the 7.8 billion people in the planet? And tell us, what assumptions are you making for making these quite positive and feel-good presentation?
My assumption, which is as good as any, because as you know, even the scientists themselves cannot agree on how to analyze the virus. The virus still is unknown to many people. You know, whether asymptomatic people are contagious, they still are not agreed. So my own opinion is that it will take at least the next 18 months from now for the vaccine to be discovered and to be widely distributed. But even by that time, the behavior of people will not yet be normal. They will still be very afraid of the virus because they have known that other simple diseases like the common flu, even dengue and so on and so forth, have had vaccines for a long time, but they keep on recurring. And so, which means that I foresee that for a long time, consumers will have modified behavior and will definitely not lead to any strong recovery of malls, of public events, and so on and so forth for a long time. But people will start now having as part of their regular habits, wearing masks when they have any illness, even just simple cold, washing their hands more frequently, using alcohol, and so I think that will be now a permanent part of human behavior, which of course will produce industries like, I'm sure you know, liquor is now producing alcohol for their hands, no? And masks, for example, I don't think we should import our masks and our face shields they're so easy to produce. Why should we import them from China? So all our garments factories, those that closed down in Mactan, should all turn towards personal protective equipment. So there will be new industries. Now, obviously, the ones that I mentioned as sunrise sectors, those are the ones that will have quick recoveries. You don't have to wait 10 to 20 years, no? They will be recovering definitely next year. And that is where the challenge is. How do people who used to be in garments, if they cannot all focus on personal equipment, how do they start growing high value crops in empty lots close to Busay, etc., so they can grow sweet papaya, they can grow honeydew melons, and so forth. I'm just giving a very specific example that there are opportunities for diversification, even of the middle class, into high value agriculture. And there are enough companies, Harvest, East West Seeds, that can guide us to go into these types of diversification programs. So I'm sure you've heard the movement in Manila. A lot of middle class people are actually growing a lot of food in their own homes, even in just containers, hydroponics, and so on and so forth. So those are the things that will come as a result of the pandemic.
So as entrepreneurs, you really have to find, pivot into opportunities that are available in the next 5 or 10 years even, right?
Shift from the sunset industries to the sunrise industries.
Okay, Bernie, we know for a fact that there were two major global events that happened in the past. We had the 1918 Spanish flu,
Correct.
which killed over half a billion people, and
Correct.
also the 1929, the global depression.
Yes.
How would you compare? I know it's maybe too early to tell, but we
Yeah.
know for a fact that we've been in this now for about 8 months or even
Yeah.
longer. How would you compare this crisis, this pandemic, with those other two in terms of recovery, in terms of the impact on the world for the long term and the short term?
Oh, definitely much better off than the 1918 Spanish flu because of the tremendous progress in medicine. Definitely, we can lick this pandemic much faster than they did during the time, 2017 to 2019. We also have better tools that were started in the New Deal, which was Roosevelt's approach to the Great Depression. As I said, our central bank, just take a look at what happened in 2018. Our inflation went as high as 6%.
Mhm.
Automatically, the central bank was able to move and brought it down. So we have now more modern tools to combat some of these economic challenges. So definitely our recovery will be much faster than either the Spanish flu time or the Great Depression.
Are you referring to the worldwide recovery, or are you referring to the Philippines?
Both, I think both. I think even if you take a look at some of these countries that are hard hit by the pandemic, like Spain, I always remind them that even if there are second or third waves, if you take a look at the number of deaths, they're very low now. So which means people will now have a higher ability to take risks. And they say, if we want to restore the economy, we better start now going out more often, even if we may be in danger of infection. At any way, we will not die. So that
Right.
will,
Well, that goes to the next question, Bernie. How do you think the government is doing enough to convince our population that the future is bright? Because again, as I said, listening to your presentation, I sort of really felt, okay, well, it's bright. But
yeah,
if you're in the middle, you're in the center of the pandemic and you're in business, and of course, depends on how affected your business is and where you are, it's sometimes quite difficult to see forward and see the end, the light at the end of the tunnel. So do you think the government should do something about it, or even the business sector? What are your suggestions?
well, to be fair, I think there are enough people in government who are talking in a bullish way. Governor Diokno is always very positive when he talks about the economy. Sani Dominguez uh, doesn't dwell on the short-term problems. In fact, they're very proactive in saying, let's spend as much as possible at our stimulus packages so we can revive the economy. So you see them acting. And I think this is a good sign for the private sector that their government realizes that right now the main role for recovery is in the hands of the government. Right now, the main role for recovery cannot be in the private sector because
Definitely. But you know, there was a lot of criticism in the early part of the Bayanihan
yes,
Act to Heal Us Act that the government allocated a very small percentage of our GDP to sort of not support but to fight against COVID,
yes,
even less than 2% compared to the other countries where so
I
much has been allocated. So what can you say about this?
I think they've been responding to that. That's why in the second package, they have announced this more than $9 billion worth of borrowings, despite the fact that a few other unenlightened people are saying, oh, we're borrowing too much, etc., etc. They just look at the absolute amounts. They don't look at the debt to GDP ratio. But the government is ignoring those criticisms. No? And in fact, some also unenlightened people saying, oh, we are going to be owned by the Chinese because we are borrowing a lot from them. That's not true. The Chinese are very good in promising. They're very poor in delivering. We have gotten very little from the Chinese. In fact, if we take a look at infrastructure projects that are actually being implemented, they're mostly Japanese and Koreans and others, no? So you have some unenlightened criticisms that the government listens to, but completely ignores. And there are people in government who still want to increase the stimulus packages. Of course, they have to also play the balancing act. As I said, if we reach 70% GDP debt ratio, I think we should be more prudent. Right now, it's about 50%, so we can still afford to go higher. No.
Okay, let's talk about the impact of the economic impact of the virus in terms of the broader population. You know, our employees, our workers, who have basically lost many of their jobs. Moving forward, how would this impact them and their families in the near future?
Well, definitely, a lot of them are having difficulties putting food on the table, as you probably have seen. It's very sorry sight of former taxi drivers and the drivers going
Yeah,
out
I saw that. Yeah.
in the street. However, that has been partly solved between April to July. As I said, in April it was worse. 17.7% of our labor force was unemployed. Now, the fact it went down to 10% meant that either some of these people who were laid off were once again reinstated in their old jobs, or they found other jobs. Like, for example, a lot of these drivers are now all over over Metro Manila, delivering all types of goods through e-trade. As you very well know, everyone now is turning to delivery, and these people are now actually being employed in their motorcycles, in their bicycles, and so on and so forth. Now, I would like to see a lot of these unemployed people doing what I mentioned about growing high-value crops together with middle-class people. You know, I cannot expect poor farmers to have enough savings to be able to invest, even in the minimum of facilities that are needed for high-value crops. That's why I'm glad, as I said, there are former pilots, former stewardesses, former whatever they are, who are the ones actually going today so they can invest whatever technology is needed. And so, but they can employ definitely these jobless farmers. No? So I'm very, very much in favor of getting into a lot of the value chain of food. As I said, not only farming, but all the possible areas. You know, in real estate, the one that is going to rise the fastest will be warehouses. Logistics is going to be the key to most industries now.
Bernie, do you have any specific suggestions on how the government can focus more on developing products of high value in terms of agriculture, in
Yes.
terms of financial support, in terms of technical training?
Yes.
Because it looks like in your presentation and even the way you're talking right now, it seems to be a very important component moving forward into the future.
Yes. Well,
What do you think the government should do in terms of focusing on this direction?
Well, first of all, to focus their subsidies to SMEs towards these types of entrepreneurs who are shifting for the first time into these high value crops or processing or logistics, whatever it is in the value chain of agribusiness. You know, I warn the people who are in charge of the stimulus packages for micro businesses that they should be very particular that they don't create what are now being called business zombies, meaning to support small industries that have no future. For example, hundreds of restaurants will have to be closed permanently. I don't see them recovering. But precisely, they should shift to that, that in the area of food that has a promise, which is in producing high value crops, no, processing, and so on and so forth. So the government has to be very discerning in using the, I think they talk about 80 billion pesos of subsidy for SMEs. Not just any SME should be subsidized. And that's why it's so good for them to know what are the sunrise industries. Those that are trying to produce PPEs, definitely they should support.
Are you in constant communication with the planners of our country at the moment, Bern? I know you were very involved previously in the previous administrations. What involvement are you having in terms of the advice and the forecast that you are making right now for this country?
Well, through CRC, all of them subscribe to all the studies that we are making. And I know that they follow all my pronouncements that are in the media. And I coincide with a good number of them in webinars like this. So I'm not as close as a personal advisor to people under this government as I was in all the governments, because I'm not particularly close to Duterte. So I don't volunteer. But to the extent that Sally Dominguez is a friend, Jokno has been an associate, and so on and so forth, they know what I think, and they know what all the proposals I'm making. There's no official relationship. As my most official relationship was with Fidel Ramos, of course with Cory Aquino. I was appointed by Globe Macabal Arroyo as private sector representative in some of the state enterprises. So this is, as far as the present government is concerned, it's really through the technocrats that we channel our advice.
Okay, good. Now, my last question before I pass it on to some of the guys who might like to ask you a question. You've been a keen observer of how this country has moved. You write a column and you speak to a lot of people and you advise corporations. On a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being the highest, what's your grade of how this government is running this country today? Not only in terms of dealing with the pandemic, but also managing our financial capabilities and our resources. What's your rating to them and why?
In the economic area, definitely I would rate it 8. While I would rate the former administration of Noy, let's say 6.
Okay, so this is better.
There has
Okay.
been, yes.
How about in terms of dealing with the crisis, the pandemic?
Well, I cannot compare them to other governments, no?
Definitely.
Compared to other countries, very low, probably 5. Especially if you take a look at Vietnam, the way Vietnam has done it, and we are a peer of Vietnam, no? So definitely the pandemic management has not been a part.
Okay.
Yeah.
So anybody on the floor would want to ask a question? Guys, please.
Yes, good afternoon, Dr. Villegas.
Good afternoon.
My question is, based on your presentation, what will we do with the excess hotel room capacity and commercial spaces in Cebu Island, which we have a lot? Thank you.
Well, I'm not an expert in those businesses, but first of all, to really see how you can cater domestic tourists. And domestic tourists, my experience in Spain, for example, is that they don't stay in Marriott's, in Intercons, in expensive hotels. They stay in what are known as bed and breakfast facilities. And therefore, if they're going to survive, some of the establishments will have to convert themselves to the level of bed and breakfast facilities to be able to charge those rates that domestic tourists expect. For example, you go to Puerto Princesa, there are dozens of bed and breakfast facilities, no? And they are actually being patronized by domestic tourists. So that's my first. So I have very little hope for the Shangri-Las, the Marriotts, the Grand Hyatts for some time to come. Because until the foreign tourists come, they're not going to attract domestic tourists. So now, some of them, of course, had the fortune of being hired by BPO and IT companies to house their workers so they can be close to their work. So that might continue. Some of these BPO IT might still continue to use hotels to house their workers so they don't have to be traveling too far from work to home. Some of the malls, one analysis I saw of one of the real estate brokerage firm is that the malls will still attract a lot of low-income consumers once they feel comfortable about the pandemic, because these low-income consumers go to malls as public parks. They go there with their families, etc. They may spend but little. High-income consumers will no longer go back to malls because they have perfected the ability of ordering practically everything online. So that's, I think, the message to SM and others. You have to redesign your malls that you will be ready to accept big masses of low-income households who will use your malls as a public park, because that's one of our biggest shortage. We don't have public parks for a lot of low-income families, though. So that's my thinking on how these facilities will have to be redesigned.
Okay. Any questions? How about Edmond? Mon?
Thank you for a very wonderful, very enriching, and as Bonnie would put it, very uplifting presentation.
Thank you.
It's a good dose of pragmatism to be reminded that while we are in the middle of a pandemic, yes, this too will pass. And eventually we will have to come out of it in hopefully better shape. One thing you did mention, though, is that we have to pivot. Some of the industries that are expected to have an L-shaped recovery, as you pointed out, may have to pivot to the more V-shaped industries. Having said that, my simple question is really very straightforward and very pragmatic as well. One of the biggest factors would be, as you pointed out, resources, human resources, government support, and as well as financial resources to be able to pivot, for businesses to be able to convert their portfolio of industries into something more adaptable, something more relevant to the new economy. What are your thoughts on that, Dr. Villegas? Do we have enough, given the time limit of 2 years, 3 years to pivot? Do we have enough support from government? Do we have enough resources in terms of human capabilities, technical skills, and as well as logistical support, infrastructure? There's still a lot of areas that we might need support there. And as well as, of course, when it comes to the banking industry, the willingness of banks and financial institutions to support the businessmen who are trying to make that pivot.
Thank you, Edmund, for that. First of all, as far as skills are concerned, I will just repeat what I said. People who thought that they can make a living out of white-collar job should really make an important decision that they are better off as plumbers, as carpenters, as mechanics, as people using their hands. That is definitely a pivot that I would like to see in our human resources, though. Now, as regards the government still has the resources in the Bayanihan 2 to try to help specific sectors. In fact, they're trying to see what they can do for the airline companies. I mean, we cannot allow the airline companies to just completely disappear, no? Because definitely when domestic tourism is able to recover, they will have to be transported by Cebu Pacific, PAL, and so on and so forth. And the government is ready to help these airline industries to survive this transition.
Okay.
And the government is also listening to the types of analysis that we are making, that they should not put money in losing propositions. No? So it's a matter now of their being selective. And banks themselves are looking precisely for new areas where they can shift their loan programs. And that's why I'm always taking opportunities to dialogue with banks, especially now that interest rates are quite so low. There's been opportunity really for entrepreneurs who are willing to take the risk to convince the banks that whenever they're pivoting, they're going into more promising sectors. And I know for a fact a good number of people who are in the losing areas like printing, publishing, and so on and so forth, going into something completely new like raising hogs, despite the fact that they still have the risks of, the diseases and so on and so forth, but they're willing to take the risk because they're being helped by technology companies. I think they're in the area of shifting to high value crops. I would not depend on government for the technology. It has to be the private sector that will provide the technology. I mentioned two of them I'm very familiar with. I'm sure you've heard of Harvest, Taiwanese source of technology. Taiwanese are very good in high value crops. And the other one is European, East-West Seeds. They also are all over the country trying to help people pivoting to high value food production. So that's how I would suggest different sectors to participate.
So